Next to watercolor, gouache is what I paint with the most. I love it for its unique qualities like perpetual blendability, matte finish, and intense color. I've been painting with gouache for a few years now, during which I've tried many different brands. There are quite a few brands on the market, from cheap student grade paint to expensive high quality artist grade, so I know it can be a bit overwhelming for a beginner to choose where to start. So in this video, I'll share my favorites and explain some of the things I look for in a good gouache paint, as well as my favorite tools for using gouache. Just like my other videos, I've posted all of this information on my blog for quick reference with links to specific brands and colors, and if you'd like to watch my gouache landscape tutorials, check out the link to my Patreon page below. Let's get started! These are all my colors, but you absolutely don't need a large set to get started. I never use more than 8 or 10 colors in a single painting. In fact, I very rarely use more than 5 or 6. And while I've grown my collection of gouache over the years, my favorite way to paint is with the primary colors, plus white. My goal with my set of primary colors is to ensure that I can mix pretty much any color I need. To some people, the obvious choice is a cadmium yellow, a cadmium red, and an ultramarine. This is pretty classic. However, what this selection lacks is the ability to stretch the colors just a little bit farther on the spectrum. For instance, it's difficult to mix some really strong, vibrant purples with these colors. It's also a challenge to mix really vibrant lime green. And of course, it's not always necessary to use those colors. But what if you need them? That's why my preferred primary set is lemon yellow, quinacridone magenta, and helio turquoise. I'm not sure if helio turquoise is exclusive to Schmincke at the moment, but it's my favorite version. You can find other colors that are very similar to these, but the idea is that you're using a bright yellow, nice and clean and crisp, leaning a bit more towards the greenish side rather than cadmium yellow. You're using a strong carmine type red, which leans a little more towards blue rather than warm yellow like a cadmium red does. And you're using a phthalo blue, which is a lot more powerful than an ultramarine, and that's what will give you those brilliant purples and greens. And you can even mix a color that's very similar to cobalt turquoise. In addition, if you touch a tiny bit of the quinacridone magenta into the yellow, you can mix a pretty strong red. So it's like having a bonus. But you're probably thinking, okay, yeah, these colors are great, but they're really intense. Maybe a bit too intense. But you can easily mix grays and browns and neutral tones with any set of colors. Which is why I think this is the ideal primary set, because you get the best of both worlds. Really intense, vibrant colors when you need them, and gorgeous neutrals as required. When I sat down to record this video, I was a little bit overwhelmed because I have a lot of gouache, and I don't want to give the impression that you have to buy all this expensive gouache to get started. So for all the beginners out there, don't worry, you don't have to spend an arm and a leg to get started with gouache. In fact, you really only need 3 colors, red, yellow, and blue. But you also probably want to get white because with gouache, a lot of times you're mixing with white to achieve different tones. But with these 3 tubes, you can do so much. For me, it comes down to finding that balance of perfect paint consistency, beautiful colors, light fastness, and affordability. That's the main reason I don't just stick with one single brand. I know that it's tempting to start off with a big set of gouache with all of the oranges and greens and purples provided, but you can mix those yourself really easily. So this strategy would be a really affordable way to get started with some high quality gouache without buying the whole set. Plus the bonus of using a limited palette means you're starting to learn how to mix color from the very beginning. Mixing your colors is very empowering and it trains you to be a more intuitive painter. Sometimes I'll wait until my favorite art store has a sale, like 20 or 30% off, and then I'll buy all of my favorite colors. So I have 2 or 3 tubes of all my favorite colors at all times. This means I don't have to worry about running out in the middle of a painting. But the really awesome thing about gouache, and it's pretty similar to watercolor, one tiny little tube of gouache is packed with so much pigment, especially if you use one of the higher quality brands. So as I said, I own a lot of Winsor Newton gouache because it's very affordable in Scotland. Because it's so affordable here, it's the one I recommend the most because I think the quality plus the affordability, the consistency, the light fastness, all of those things combined, it's a really good, high quality, all around performer. That said, I also own quite a few tubes of the Schmincke Horadam gouache. I find this one to be the best consistency, opacity. They have an amazing selection of colors and light fast ratings. And overall, I just find it to be an absolute joy to paint with. But because it's more expensive, I usually only buy the specialty colors or colors I can't buy with Winsor Newton. For instance, the titanium gold ochre completely replaced my need for yellow ochre, and I can only get this specific color in this brand. But on the other end of the spectrum, I also have a few tubes of the Shinhan Professional Designer's Gouache, which I think is relatively new. It's their version of really high quality designer's gouache, and they have quite a few light fast colors. And this is one of the cheapest brands I can buy in Scotland. So I can replace some colors in my palette with a really affordable option and keep the overall price down. I do also own a couple tubes of the Holbein Artist Gouache. It was sent to me from a friend, but I find the consistency to be just a little bit too stiff or too dry for my taste. I prefer the Winsor Newton and the Schmincke because they're really, really creamy. The Winsor Newton is a little bit more liquidy, and I find that for my specific technique, it works a lot better. But I'm not putting Holbein down in any way. It's a super, super high quality gouache. So I did a little comparison test just out of curiosity of the 4 brands that I own. The pigments aren't exactly the same, but I did my best to match the colors. And I put a big blob of each brand, of each tube, on the palette. And then I did this first swatch. I was more looking for how the gouache on the palette was drying over time than what the swatch was doing on the paper. So I came back in a few hours to see if they had crumbled or if they were still creamy. They were definitely stiff. The Holbein was the one that started to crumble the fastest. So then I let it sit overnight just to see, and the next day, the Holbein was definitely very crumbly. But I was able to spray all of them and reactivate all of them really easily, and then I did this bottom swatch. So you can see it's just as highly pigmented, just as intense. You don't have to really worry about your gouache drying overnight. You can spray it. It won't be 100% opaque the next day if you spray it, but you can at least use it and it's not going to be a waste. Because these are such high quality brands, they pack a lot of pigment into the tube, so you can still use them even if you dilute them a little bit. In the studio, I use a Redgrass Stay Wet palette. Redgrass sent this one to me last year to test out, and I've been giving them feedback. There are a few versions of these on the market, but this is my favorite for the size and quality of the sponge and palette paper. The idea is you squeeze your paint onto the palette paper, and the moisture from the sponge below keeps it moist for a lot longer. And then when you're done painting, you can close the lid and keep your mixes fresh for days, if not weeks. I actually once forgot I had paint in mine for 2 weeks, and when I opened it again, it was like new. Since gouache is opaque and we're often mixing white into our colors, it's actually ideal to use a gray or at least a toned surface to mix on, because then you can see how bright or vibrant or light your colors are compared to what's below it. So even just a piece of gray plastic you can get from the hardware store would work for a palette. Before I got my Stay Wet palette, I just did a little DIY setup, and you can use items you find around your house for this. A damp paper towel provides a moist environment for your gouache, and you could even cover this in cling film to keep it wet between sessions. Or you can buy a thin kitchen sponge and get some palette paper and make a homemade version of the Stay Wet palette. Just get creative and do something that works for you and your budget. And then we have my travel palette, which is probably the thing I use the most. I paint outside a lot, and I even use it in the studio when I just want to do a quick setup. The great thing about this palette in particular is that it's small and portable, and it keeps the gouache moist for a really long time. I've gone weeks between using it and the gouache stays wet inside. It does require a bit of TLC to keep it clean and mold-free, but I think the key is to use it often. And because it's so portable and easy to use, I do. A spray bottle is a must for keeping your gouache moist during a painting session. And you'll definitely need a bit more water than you might when you're painting with watercolor, because you have to clean your brushes a lot. One of my favorite things is this water container. It has 3 separate compartments, and I can use each one for a different color. And this helps avoid cross-contamination, especially if I'm doing a long painting session and I don't get up to change the water often. I use it for watercolor, gouache, acrylic, everything. It also has a very convenient brush holder on the handle. Speaking of brushes, of course we all need a good brush set, and I made my own. So if you want to buy my brush set, there's a link in the description. The first set sold out within a few hours, but there'll be another set released hopefully in a month or 2. I've done an extensive gouache brush review, and I have a lot of information on my blog about this as well, so hopefully there's a good option for every budget out there. I have a lot of exciting gouache videos planned for 2023, so if you're interested in this medium, make sure to subscribe before you go. I'm totally open to requests for gouache videos and different techniques and whatever you guys are interested in seeing, but mostly I just look forward to sharing how my process has developed over time and taking you outside and painting the amazing Scottish Highlands. If this video was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Otherwise, I'll see you all soon. Take care.